Hello, and welcome to Transforming Disruption to Impact, a webinar presented in partnership with IAVE. We're so delighted you can join us today to explore this timely topic and hear from colleagues around the globe. I'm Beth Steinhorn. I'm president of VQ Volunteer Strategies, and I'm delighted to be your moderator and host today. Like so many individuals in our fields across the globe, I watched in 2020 as the COVID-19 pandemic challenged, starting in 2019 and then into 2020, challenged the way that organizations and communities provide services and challenged the way that we engage volunteers in our mission critical work. As late in 2019 and throughout 2020 unfolded, I also saw many other factors disrupting our field. And yet, some organizations and communities shut down, understandably, often with very good intention, saying we can't engage volunteers in our work. Yet others recognized that volunteers were part of the answer, part of the response, and part of the solution. It was to a great extent that observation, that disparity, and our intrigue with it that inspired me and three other colleagues of mine, one of whom has joined us today and will be speaking shortly, Jerome Tennille, along with Doug Bolton and Craig Young, to set out to gather stories from individuals, thought leaders, to gather their lessons, their advice, and most importantly, their strategies, their successful strategies, and compile them into a book. Our book includes or features stories from nearly 24 leaders, some previously well-known, others who should be well-known for their perseverance and innovations. The stories include those from not just volunteer engagement professionals, though those are powerful stories, but also from CEOs, funders, corporate engagement leaders, and practitioners, as I mentioned, to share their innovations and their strategies. I'm honored today to be joined by four of those individuals who will be sharing their stories with you. Our goal was really not to collect the definitive collection of proven pathways, but to inspire conversation and dialogue like that, which we're going to have this today, so that others can share their proven pathways to impact and learn how to break trail of their own journey from disruption to impact, because we have all faced disruption. And disruption can be challenging for organizational leaders, for volunteers, and of course, for the communities being served. The interruption and limitations were at times disheartening, disturbing, and disconcerting, but disruption is not inherently bad. Disruption, as we saw, can also be the impetus to release ourselves from the tyranny of the way we've always done things. If viewed as an opportunity, disruption can invite us to revisit, rethink, and reinvent the way that we achieve our mission. It may even inspire us to retire practices that no longer serve us. So it really can bring about new perspective, and that's what our panelists are here to share today. And shortly, I will be introducing our panelists, but I'm going to start first by just briefly sharing some themes, the landscape of disruption, so that you can get a sense of some of the common themes that we saw, and also share through your own comments and hopefully questions using our Q&A option in your dashboard, so that we can also hear from you and you can learn more from our panelists. So let me start by just briefly painting that picture of the landscape of disruptions, because it was varied and widespread. As so many of us know, volunteering was disrupted in very significant ways, of course, due to health concerns and regulations. We also saw services being suspended and others being extended due to increased demand for services. I'm going to talk briefly as well about the increased recognition of inequitable access to volunteering in the US and beyond. Also, the increase in ageism in the global dialogue and discourse around volunteerism. And finally, I'll talk briefly about shifting expectations of and by volunteers. So we'll start with this first one very briefly. Volunteerism being disrupted. According to studies by Volunteer Match, a large volunteer search engine in the United States, by March of 2020, 93% of all volunteering had just been reported canceled. We know that organizations like IAVE, Volunteer Match, and others that are represented on our panel today, volunteer support organizations, were immediately challenged to adapt, making the case for volunteers, for walking that fine line between engaging volunteers and keeping them, and also keeping them safe, was a tightrope that was challenging. We'll hear from Wendy, and we heard from Wendy and Nicole Nicole Cirillo in the book, that it was really challenging to gain recognition for the important contribution volunteers could make during the crisis. And yet the mobilization of volunteers was so necessary to provide help during the pandemic. In other words, we were forced as volunteer involving organizations and volunteer support organizations to adapt in significant ways. At the same time, we saw that services were being suspended or extended. And of course, that, especially for organizations like those who dealt with health and with food insecurity or safety net services for economic challenges, which were so profound around the world, we saw that recruitment for volunteers to serve in these capacities dramatically shifted, as did the way that services were delivered. Virtual service and engagement, which had been around for decades, finally broke through the remaining barriers, the remaining perceived resistance to engaging volunteers virtually, and became the norm for so many. And yet, we still sought out and desired and longed for human connection. As Laura Plato wrote about this disruption of volunteerism as a facet, as a manifestation of human connection being interrupted, she wrote, "It's through mindful human presence that we bear witness to one another in all our messy, joyous, and inspired humanity, and in the process grow to understand and connect to one another, ourselves, and our world more deeply." So while we celebrate that virtual practice of engaging volunteers and delivering services, we've all been challenged to figure out how to leverage virtual technology while still maintaining that human connection. We also saw an increased spotlight in the US and beyond of the inequities in terms of access to volunteerism, inequitable access in terms of race, in terms of, but really by all standards, economic status, social status, and also an increased recognition of the value that informal volunteers bring and can bring to organizations, and innovative partnerships that recognize that the power of informal volunteers. So we saw, we continue to see an increased recognition and attention to this long-standing challenge. And we saw, as I mentioned, ageism, increased ageism driven by cross-generational blaming. Early in the pandemic, in public and private discourse, we saw young people and heard young people being blamed for the spreading of the virus, while older adults were seen as driving the shutdowns. This sticky narrative pitted generations against each other, and it was compounded by the divergent economic effects adversely affecting old and young alike. So we began to see innovations and new perspectives around how volunteers can serve in mixed generational, co-generational cohorts, not older adults serving younger adults and younger adults serving older adults, but young and old together, serving side by side to help address a common cause. So we've seen interesting innovations around that. And finally, we see a continuation of the evolution and a major shift in volunteer expectations. Organizations, we've seen for a long time that organizations were facing different expectations by volunteers, and that was accelerated significantly due to the events in the last 2.5 years to 3 years. The idea of serving in a transactional, a time and place-based volunteer activity was really being replaced by a desire from volunteers and by volunteers for a more transformative approach that really could be very disruptive. Systems that need to change in order to accommodate this are complex, and yet we really saw many organizations beginning to embrace new practices that allow volunteers not only to make change, but to be changed through the experience. So those were some of the disruptions we saw. In collecting these stories, and in the stories we may be hearing today from our panelists, we will also hopefully reveal some of the themes and be able to unpack some of the themes that we saw running through many of the stories and accounts that we were able to collect. We saw themes such as a rethinking of the relationship and the definition of community. At a very tactical level, how can we maintain a sense of community with a hybrid workforce and a volunteer force? And as well as a redefining of what a volunteer is and how they fit in our organizational community. We saw innovations, as I've alluded to, including new ways of engaging volunteers and adopting previously resisted practices, like virtual volunteering in some cases. We see a whole new perspective on leadership development, including new ways to look for leadership and recognize it from informal communities, from partner communities. We also see, in my view, in some cases at long last, a new way of looking at investment. What does it take to engage volunteers, and how can investments in engaging volunteers and volunteer infrastructure be part of COVID recovery? And finally, this shift from transactional to transformational. Again, we see this theme running through so many of the stories that we collected. So today, we are not only going to be hearing about some of those that we collected in our book, but more importantly, from our esteemed panel that I'm honored to be sharing the webinar with. And so I'm going to ask that they come on camera, and we will be able to see them in real life rather than just their pictures here, and really embrace our panelists. Again, I encourage all of our participants to please use the Q&A for sharing your questions along the way. But I'd like to start by asking each of our panelists, Wendy Osborne, Jerome Tennille, Frederick Sadia, and Ksenia Vonovich, to please each introduce themselves. And I'm going to give them each a couple minutes to share their name, their role, and then briefly, what were some of the most impactful disruptions that affected your organizations and community? I'm going to start with Wendy Osborne. So Wendy, please introduce yourself and share the answers to those most impactful disruptions for IAVE.
Thank you, Beth. I'm Wendy Osborne. I'm a senior consultant with IAVE. Prior to working with IAVE, I was the CEO of a national volunteer centre in the United Kingdom. Looking at what happened during the COVID pandemic, for IAVE, one of the biggest disruptions was that 2020 was supposed to be our World Volunteer Conference year. An unbroken record of having a World Volunteer Conference every 2 years. And that unbroken record stems back from the early 1970s, so 50 years. So that was a major disruption. And I think the second major disruption was, and I think IAVE shared this with lots of organizations, this sense that all norms were broken. How we did business, was what were we going to do? And how should we do business going forward? And that whole element of uncertainty, never mind crisis, was really an impacting on the organization in understanding what we could do to support the organizations that are members of IAVE. We're essentially an organization that is about supporting the infrastructure that you previously mentioned, Beth. And how could we do that? No face-to-face convenings, no sense of what the needs were emerging in the crisis situation. So I think there was that certain, first of all, that sort of practical disruption of no World Volunteer Conference. And then that sense of what are we going to do, which I think was a real disruptor initially for the organization.
Thank you, Wendy. Next, I'd like to introduce Jerome, or give Jerome Tennille a chance to introduce himself as a colleague, and also, I should note, a co-editor on this book as well. Jerome?
Thank you so much, Beth, and thank you, IAVE, for hosting this wonderful session and panel. My name is Jerome Tennille. I'm the Director of Social Impact and ESG for the Uplift Agency. The Uplift Agency is a full-service corporate social impact and sustainability consulting firm. I will just note that, during the pandemic, I was with a different employer back then. But I think, for me, back then, I was working for a global hospitality company. And I think the most impactful disruption that we saw as just really an industry is the financial disruption that we felt as a company. Personally, I was furloughed for 6 months, and many of my colleagues were also furloughed. We experienced layoffs and everything that you could possibly imagine that I think a lot of others were feeling. And so it was almost a crisis of how do we continue to move forward as a company and to support our associates while at the same time supporting the communities that we have historically supported through great times of need, whether that's man-made or natural disasters. So that was, I think, one of the biggest moments of disruption. And then also coming out the other side of that and trying to figure out, how are we going to rebuild our volunteer engagement program that, pre-pandemic was incredibly robust, as we had hundreds of thousands of employees across 130 countries and territories across the globe who have historically volunteered in their local communities.
Thanks, Jerome. Next, let's turn it over to Ksenia Fonovic from Italy to share a little bit about her background and some of the biggest disruptions.
Hello from Roma, from Italy, which was one of the first and hardest hit by this massive disruption of COVID-19. I work with a volunteer support center. So what we do is help and support organizations to run their associational life and pursue their mission. So we do a lot of consultancy, training, a lot of promotion activities. So everything we do as volunteer support center is meeting, talking to people, really touching our volunteers and volunteer leaders, which is exactly what all associations do. It's mainly creating and maintaining relationships. So this is what COVID-19 and quarantine did to us. It severed what is our daily bread and breath. So I say that this is the major disruption. The other thing is that Italy is made of and by third age volunteers, like the major volunteer force in Italy up to now, since the 80s, early 90s, where the modern associational life, especially in the social and ecological movement, was born and built up, were led by, thought by, and also the biggest numbers of relationships and volunteering hours that were out there in the field, especially with frail categories, was done by men and women of 60 and up. This is our major volunteering force in Italy. From one day to the other, with the COVID-19 quarantine, this generation has become frail to be protected and closed in their homes, volunteering force. So this was, I think, the major disruption, as you call it, the big challenge and the impact that COVID-19 created.
Thank you, Ksenia, and we look forward to unpacking that a little more with you. And next, I'd like to introduce Fred Sadia. If you can unmute yourself now and introduce yourself. Thank you. Fred.
Thank you so much. My name is Frederick Sadia, and I come from Kenya. I am the secretary and national coordinator to the network that brings a number of our volunteer organizations in Kenya together. I'm also privileged to serve as the country leader for Good Eats Day movement. I'm grateful to Forum that recently have been allowed to be part of the board for Forum. And so it is exciting to be part of this. And thank you for the opportunity to have it. I think first I would say that when COVID happened, it disrupted the heartbeat of Africa. And this I mean because for us, socializing and interactions in person is what keeps Africa going on. It is sooner than later, there were lockdowns and everything came to a cropper, everything got shut down. And this made us have a big fear because we didn't know what was going to be next. And as I've always shared in other platforms, that the media reports were indicating that Africa was going to be a graveyard. And so we knew that Kenya wouldn't be far away from being part of the graveyard. So this thing made most of us who are volunteers really to rethink about first our lives and whether we were willing to go out to communities. And so there was a bit of resentment in the initial stages of COVID, but then the resilience in volunteers couldn't make us sit down and just relax. So we got ourselves right into the communities and started doing the best we could, given that most of the international volunteers were also relocating back home. But the major disruption for us was, of course, socialization. We couldn't interact. At the volunteer involving organization society, we couldn't do our planned activities generally, and especially towards the end of the year when we celebrate volunteering. In Kenya, we have what we call the National Volunteer Week that runs around way from November, a period like this, and culminating into us celebrating the International Volunteers Day, IVD, on the 5th of December. We couldn't do that because 2020, everything was just shut down. The other thing that happened to us, since that I am the country leader for the Good Eats Day movement, we also have a separate calendar and engaging young people, about 500 young people, mostly students and young professionals, slightly above 500. So we always have a calendar of activity that we roll out throughout the year, doing a lot of environmental conservation, visiting old age homes, visiting charitable children institutions, and just supporting in every other way. This one we couldn't do around this time, including the usual programs that we run for volunteers on capacity training, team building. We couldn't do this for the longest, I think, until maybe mid 2021. I think in conclusion, again, I could say that the momentum that we were having around volunteering in Kenya kind of came to a halt because we had a very good 2019, and we are bringing on board partners, and everyone were buying in the idea of volunteering. We had a good support from government, but all of a sudden we couldn't continue. Again, now it is picking from the pieces. So this was the kind of experience we had. But yeah, all is catching up now. Yeah.
Thank you. And actually, Frederick, you lead in nicely to my next question, or the first question to toss out to the whole panel, which is focused around goals for engaging volunteers in service. You mentioned that in 2019, you had a really good year with new partnerships and a lot of momentum. One of the things we heard by the end of 2020 and in 2021 was, of course, we can't measure our success in the same way that we did pre-COVID. So how did and this is to anyone on the panel, how did goals for engaging volunteers in service shift between pre-COVID and now? Organizational goals or measures of success. How did that shift for any of you?
I guess I'll go ahead and start. So I think about goals in sort of like two different buckets, right? There's the long-term goals, and I think for our company, those long-term goals did not really change. I mean, these are goals that extend out for 3 to 5 years, and while those long-term goals really remain the same, I think it was sort of the shorthand goals that we could look at from month to month that really changed, because I think what we had to do is we had to start to redefine what success looked like and what success looked like in that moment. And so for us, coming sort of outside of the other side of the pandemic, and having been financially impacted as a company, we had to really rethink the foundation that would equip and engage or empower our employees all across the globe to volunteer. Because I think what we saw is that there was this sort of global recognition that the mechanisms of change, the mechanisms that engage volunteers as we knew it, were essentially dismantled, in many ways out of necessity. But then there was also this mindset shift that recognized that the systems of change were no longer effective but enough to get us forward, moving in the right direction that we wanted to see. And so what I mean by that is we had to internally redefine and rethink, how do we think about volunteering? How do we engage our employees in a way that we've never really engaged them before? And when I think about it like that is, the hospitality industry is very, it's fairly unique in that it's very human-centered. It's really service-driven, and that means in person oftentimes. And so we had to really rethink, how do we engage our employees in a more remote or hybrid fashion, and then also build the tools that would effectively engage people in the way that I think people were looking for and how the community best needed it. So we essentially had to go look at how we were defining things. We had to review our policy, all of our toolkits. We had to review all these things. And so that immediate goal for us internally was, how do we rethink and create a new foundation? And that's the first goal, right? We got to start walking again before we can even start running. So that's why I say that I think there are two different goals. There's the long-term goal, which didn't really change, but how we got to that long-term goal required us to set a lot of short-term goals based on this idea of setting a new foundation, and then also really acknowledging and accepting and being comfortable with the discomfort of maybe possibly canceling an event because of a COVID outbreak, or the uncertainty of things not necessarily going as planned as we once knew them in a pre-COVID environment. So I would say that those were, the goals that we changed. Is it was almost like, instead of looking at a whole calendar of events that we had already planned a year in advance, now it was like looking month to month and setting these incremental small wins and trying to achieve those month to month. And that's, sort of how we looked at those goals and thought about success in that moment.
Thank you, Jerome. Anyone else want to add in about shifting goals for engagement? Ksenia?
I follow Jerome in this thinking of adapting. We have never been very keen on numbers. Just okay, tick that number of engagement. But really, in rearranging our activities as volunteer support center for engaging volunteers and volunteers leaders in our activities, we have found out that it really matters the direction, the quality of the thing that must be adapted to the methodology. I'll give you a simple example. Like we do a lot of training. Before it was training courses in presence, 30 people from different organizations, and it was kind of standard and worked. COVID came, we shifted on webinars, all our training initiatives. And we got used to big numbers. Now it's been some months, not so very long, but almost a year that we started to go back to organizing in-person training activities. And we are realizing, we are very much experimenting now. What is the right measure of time, of the size of the group, and of the focus and methodology of training? So we are very much diversifying. What is online is good for something. What is the training in presence? It is really assuming a completely different meaning and quality in terms of what moves around in working with a potentially much smaller group of volunteers and volunteer leaders. And I see a similar thing happening to many volunteer associations that are going back to work. During COVID, like the focus, the attention shifted from what was very standard. I have my volunteers, I have my activities, I have my goals, and I strive to do my better in my terrain. When COVID came, everybody had to think, where can I get the right, even very small, particular resource, a volunteer or other type of help for a very particular need of that person or that part of the need that I am looking. So I think this is something that is staying with us and that is changing the way we work with the communities and with the beneficiaries.
Thank you.
May I come in a little bit?
Please.
Thank you. I think for us, the focus or the shift was in this way. As a network in Kenya, what has been our major mandate is to listen with government to develop enabling infrastructures for volunteering in the country. And this time round, the focus then changed and we started looking into means of mobilizing resources to support most of the community-based organizations which are our member organizations in the network. A reason being that most of these organizations are actually volunteer-driven and they were embedded within the communities. So the need at that particular moment in time was supplies of food, water, hand sanitizers, and stuff that really masks, things like this. So as a network, we went to doing what we don't do, because we don't compete our member organizations who actually were working with different communities. But this time around, we had to go out of our way to reach out to corporate companies, requesting for donations and channeling such donations to our youth-based organizations, community-based organizations that they were working with their communities directly. But generally also, I feel of most of the member organizations that we have in Kenya, for example, the Kenya Red Cross, we realized that they shifted focus in channeling their resources to their normal, regular programs, and instead looked at how they were now responding to the humanitarian need that was very big as a result of the pandemic, because people were home, no one was going to work. Our population, most of the populations around, majorly those who rely on day-to-day work or casual jobs that they get. And here, no one was, willing. For example, we have quite a number of young ladies and mothers who go to households seeking to, help with house chores, and then as a result get to find their daily earnings. These people couldn't do anything, and I know a number of our organizations that were working within the informal settlements, just trying to, make sure that at least a few families could afford something on the table. This was a complete shift from what we've always done over the years, sticking to just working with government and partners to think about how are we going to create an enabling infrastructure to support volunteering. And so we kind of stopped our work on policy development, policy review, bill development that we are steadily working on coming up from 2019. Thank you.
Interesting. Thank you. Thank you. Wendy, do you have anything to add?
Yes, just to add, I mean, I think, IAVE is, well, I think it's the only global organization that is really concentrated on volunteering. And we have an interest in volunteering wherever it happens and whatever the volunteers are doing. And I think very early on, it became apparent that the two branches of the networks that IAVE really supports, one is a network of leadership organizations, two of which are on the panel with me, from Italy and from Kenya. And we also have a network of global companies who are involved in employer-supported volunteering. And it became very apparent that our goals were linked to their goals. So whatever our long-term goals were about, enabling and providing information and support, there was an immediate goal that was to listen, to respond to, and to see how we could enable those organizations who are part of our key networks to deal with the disruption. And one of the simple things was, and I mean, Senya has talked about it, this relationship building. So much of that relationship building had to move online. It wasn't that it stopped. It was just that it moved into a different space. And it was very important for IAVE to have the goals that allowed those relationships between organizations to continue, so that organizations could learn from one another, could share, and also could take support from one another. So you might have had Ireland linking up with Hong Kong, and you might have had, calls from Mongolia and from Togo and from Kenya, and, and from Peru, and, across the globe. Organizations, leadership organizations for volunteering were reaching out to each other in a moment of actually sometimes desperation to find out what others were doing. And it became a really important goal for IAVE to support that and to deliver for those organizations. And when we did research in 2020, looking at the whole of the COVID experience for leadership for volunteering organizations, it became clear that that opportunity to network was actually fundamental often to people feeling that they weren't alone, and organizations learning from one another and taking, I suppose, solace from that opportunity to network, although it was all done online. And I think that remains. And also very early on, realizing that it was never going back to the way it was. And I think we see the outworkings of that now. I mean, things have changed and they're not going back. And COVID has accelerated some changes for volunteering that were probably, you know, always there, but there's acceleration. And one of those, of course, is online and digital. And, you know, this whole notion of hybrid. When did we ever use the term hybrid in relation to volunteering? But we're using this term all the time now. Our services are hybrid. And also this whole notion again of looking at the whole spectrum of volunteering, from, you know, self-help to community engagement to volunteer involving organizations, how that became much more fluid during COVID, and how we're not going back to that either. Volunteering is no longer boxed in my mind. If it ever was, it is a much more fluid engagement, and organizations are having to grapple with that as well. So I think, you know, IAVE as a support organization has had to move its goals. Fundamentally, its mission and vision remains the same, but its goals are very much now linked with how can we work with other organizations in our networks to enable them to move out of COVID, and what are the trends for volunteering, and how can we help them look at what volunteering needs and requires going forward.
Thank you, Wendy. And you raise a lot of issues for one of the questions I want to put out to the panel about what do you think will stick. But before we do that, I want to throw a little, I want to go off our planned script here and begin pulling from some of the comments in the chat. Michael in particular raised a couple comments about nimbleness, and I'd love the panel's perspective on your observations. Did you see smaller organizations being able to be nimble and adapt and pivot very quickly versus larger organizations who may be more resourced but more set in their ways and harder to, you know, more rigid in practices? So I'm curious if, in terms of, you know, the organizations you support out in your communities, organizations, your organizations itself, did you see any observation? Can you make any observations about who was able to be most nimble? What were some of the characteristics that allowed organizations to be nimble and shift and adapt and sustain their work? Any observations, any of you willing to share?
I will jump right on this because I was reading a couple of Michael Flee's comments, and it very much corresponds, I think, to perhaps the deepest learning that comes to me and for us from this situation. I don't think it is actually a question of size. It's not that big is heavy and small is nimble. It's an issue, I think, of how much structured and formalized and closed in their structured ways of doing traditionally things associations are. So yes, what we have seen that you know, structured, staffed non-profits had difficulties, but also like large formal federations, there was a gap between what is the traditional membership-based, formalized procedures way of doing things in the associations in the third sector in general, and the nimbleness, the swiftness, the adaptability of volunteer groups, which may be formalized or totally informal. But this is what made the difference. We have seen a difficulty of really associations as intermediary corps. What we see the problems that trade unions and political parties and institutional church has, while groups of volunteers and volunteer associations are ready to move because they are much more oriented to the immediate goal and share the values in the objective and are less burdened by procedures and hierarchy.
Thank you, Ksenia.
Yeah, I would
Yeah,
just
can
sort of add to,
sorry, go
hot
ahead,
topic.
Jerome.
yeah, no,
Jerome,
I
and
was,
Go
then,
ahead.
and then
I'll
Fred.
be very brief. I think it's a yes, and it's yes, all of that, and also I think what I've seen historically in the pandemic, I think really shed a light on this too. But organizations that were really able to continue to retain and engage their employees, in a more robust and more advanced manner, those are the ones that, for the most part, really weathered the storm. Moving forward, right? Even despite having financial hardships. What I'll also share is I think organizations that were infrastructure or asset heavy in what they have to manage that does require additional funding. Some of those organizations, I think, were some of the hardest hit. And some of the their ability to navigate that was in part, I would say in part because their donors were or were not flexible in how they were spending their restricted or unrestricted funding, right? So that was like I think it's something that I also saw over the last couple of years as well.
Thank you. Frederick?
Oh, thank you. I think there was a very clear indication, especially for us down here, that smaller organizations that are embedded within communities were fast to respond, were fast to adapt, as opposed to the bigger ones, because we were here thinking about how we were going to respond. And the advantage is that, at this particular time, there was also the issue of trust. Communities wanted to build trust with who are we working with, who can we know. And most of the community-based organizations driven by community volunteers were people living with them. So, this is Fred, so I knock and bring maybe a sanitizer, we belong within the same community. If this thing is going to kill us together, we're going to die all together. If we're going to rise up together, it has to take the effort of each one of us. And that level of adaptability and an ease in terms of strategy to allow community embedded volunteers to respond to the pandemic, for me, was awesome. And I think something that I seriously would want to allow us who are practicing to look and consider how we are moving forward to empower more on community volunteers, and not to leave those volunteers, other volunteers who are maybe at professional level, international volunteers within the various communities across the globe where they operate or where they serve. But there was such a distinct and very progressive impact that was caused as a result of engaging community volunteers, I suppose. But then, again, a general observation in Kenya and sharing with my colleagues from across Africa is that there was a lot of, as Jerome has said, that even within companies that were supporting volunteer initiatives, kind of thinking about retaining their own employees and reaching out to the communities, that kind of a balance was not so easy. Some were laying off their staff. Some were having their staff on half pay or reduced salaries. Bit of complicating the situation, but of course, again, mitigation plans to ensure that all of us were sailing through the very difficult moment. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
I think, Beth, just to follow up on that, I think even in the UK, there are 2 points I want to make. The first one is about this community activism. In the UK, there were a lot of what I would call that neighborliness, that people got together, they wanted to help in their street, in their village, in their town, in their community. And a lot of what Fred is saying is absolutely right. And, Senja too in Italy, where there was I just want to do something, that mindset of an individual, and harnessing that. And there can be a tension between that and a volunteer involving organization that has structures and policies and procedures. and all of that. And I think we did see in the UK a tension between that and how you bridge that, because both are equally, important, and how you bridge that community activism with the more formal volunteer involving structures. And I think we haven't got to the other side of that yet, I don't think. And I think we see various parts of that across the globe. So it will be an emerging issue for volunteering going forward. And then the second point I want to make is about leadership for volunteer involving organizations. And this whole idea of being adaptive, and that adaptability allowing you to be more resilient. And one of the things that I have seen from all of the research, it wasn't necessarily about size, it was more about attitude, is the way I would put it. And and those organizations who were prepared to reach out to others and saw partnership and collaboration and networking as vital, were the ones who actually became much more adaptive, much more flexible, and were much more impactful in their response to COVID-19.
And if I can add to that, Wendy, we saw that as well in our work, where it wasn't just the volunteer support organizations. I think, as you said, volunteer involving organizations. We saw organizations where the CEO said, it's not safe to have volunteers. We won't have them in the building. We can't talk to them. We need to wait. And others who said, staying connected until we can be together again is the most important thing. And so every employee and volunteer leader is empowered and authorized to spend time connecting with volunteers and staying in touch and figuring out how we can, gathering their ideas for continuing our services. So I appreciate that comment about attitude quite a bit, and it relates to the leadership. So we have just a few minutes left, and before I ask each panelist to share a final piece of advice based on their experiences, I do want to give our Q&A a chance to be heard. So our first question that came in early in the session today from Zach Khan, and I'll just highlight some of it, I think is very compelling. It has to do with remote volunteering, and Zach writes, recognizing the need for decolonization and international development volunteering and the opportunity that disruption provides, do you think that remote volunteering is a realistic way to deliver lasting impact? Or is the trust developed from that in-person, as you all have mentioned, the being together, the talking, the connecting, is that critical to creating impact? So I open it up to the team, to the panel to share. Jerome?
I think my first answer is no. I don't think remote volunteering will ever be like the primary means that drives long-lasting change and impact, especially in international development. It's a tool. It's one of many tools that can be used to supplement and augment, in those times where it's like most appropriate to be used. But in terms of like long-term lasting change, one person's perspective here, the in-person, the human, the social connection that we make as people, the trust building, being able to connect with one another, I think will always be sort of at the root of how we really think about volunteering and creating that great impact. One of the things the last thing I'll sort of share on this is, you can't Zoom call you're into a volunteer activity that requires you to be in front of somebody face to face and actually doing physical labor. And that's frankly a lot of the work that actually has to be done around the world, whether it's at your local food bank in an urban environment, whether it's planting trees out in an agricultural region, or whether it's doing international development amongst the community that you're actually trying to build trust with. So that's sort of my short and long answer to that.
Anyone else want to weigh in on that?
I think that for me, the answer is no. We need the connection, we need to have the human touch. And that is, for me, what it is, that human relationship that we build as volunteers as we work along the way. But of course, again, we appreciate the space of technology and maybe finding a nexus by which we blend on both would be just the best way forward. But as things turn out to be better, let's get back to the communities and serve, relate, meet people, make friends. Yeah.
Thank you.
I think I think this is this has become one of the big questions, and I'm convinced myself that technology and the digital world is now with us more than ever, and how we use it and how we maximize the opportunities that it provides for volunteering will be very important. So I don't see it as I would prefer not to see it as an either or. And see it as, a more of a fluid response to using technology to enhance volunteering. But I will say one thing, that IAVI is committed to encouraging and supporting organizations to create the enabling environment for volunteering. And that starts street by street and community by community. So it is really important that we encourage individuals wherever they are in their community to actually see that they have something to offer to give, that they can make a real difference, and that we can empower them to do that, and we can recognize the efforts that they make. And I think if we all put our efforts into that and use technology as a tool to help us do that, then I think that that would be a huge global goal. That we are not just ready to. I don't think we've cracked it yet, but I think it would be really good if we did.
Thank you, Wendy. And I'm going to take that, if you don't mind, as your final piece of advice, and that we all need to embrace that. And I'm going to invite, we have about 2 minutes left. I'm going to invite Jerome and Ksenia and Fred and Wendy, if you have an extra one, certainly I welcome you to do that. 30 seconds each. Any final piece of advice from your learnings that you think are important for our participants to take as we move forward in this work? Fred, can you start? Very brief piece of advice, lasting lesson.
Thank you very much, Beth, for this. For me, for all of us who are working with volunteers there, I think it is high time we look just within our own backyard. Let's support community volunteers. Let's support our local volunteers, empower them in the best way we can. They're the first responders.
Thank you.
We saw that. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Ksenia?
Well, I just follow Wendy and Fred. I think the community is the root and the center. And for us as infrastructure organization, the most important thing, I think, is to open up as many as possible venues of access for community volunteers to work with others, learn from others, and collaborate.
Thank you. Jerome?
Yeah, so very briefly, and this is something I write about in the book, but it's the idea that we have to just really think about embracing change, right? We are still in a rapidly changing world, so we have to embrace change. We have to shift our mindset to being more open-minded to new ideas, new practices, new strategies. And then also, if we've had those big, hairy, audacious goals, and if those have not necessarily been recognized, this is a time to reintroduce that big, hairy, audacious goal, because now people, I think, will be more receptive to it.
Great. Thank you. Wendy, any final words? Okay. Well, I want to thank our panelists today and each of you participants. Our goal in collecting these stories was to inspire dialogue. And not only was the dialogue from the panelists today inspiring and informative, but I can't wait to go back and reread all the comments on the chat and the connections you all have been making with each other. Thank you for the work you do every day and for joining us today. And we wish you great success in moving forward, regardless of the disruptions we will face. With the lessons like we've learned today, we'll be able to continue to turn it into impact. So thank you so much for joining us.